Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we have grown-up discussions aimed at grown-up people, and we consider issues of history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name's Mike Pierce, and this is the final episode in our series about the end of the early church and the start of the Middle Ages. We began a couple of months ago now by looking at the transformation of the position of the church during the 4th and early 5th centuries, from persecuted sect to favoured, and eventually, by the end of the 4th century, almost compulsory institution.
Right, and as we've seen in subsequent episodes, that new situation demanded a major rethink on basically everything. So we've been looking at several major aspects of what we can only call a theological revolution during the 4th and early 5th centuries, in which many Christian teachings were, in effect, stood on their heads.
Yes, but we're concluding this series by looking at something in some ways even more basic, something so fundamental as to be almost mundane. What about the New Testament? And what even is it? Which books should count as scripture?
Now, some people will consider this a dangerous topic.
Which is exactly why we're looking at it. You know, grown-up discussions by grown-up people.
It sounds to me like if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen.
Exactly.
And speaking of which, we have this nice meme, courtesy of yourself.
Somewhere on the interwebs, yes. It is a bit edgy, I suppose. Yeah, heresy, that special moment when you have greater spiritual insight than the apostles, disciples, apostolic fathers, the church, and the magisterium, because you have a Bible that they wrote, compiled, and gave to you. I'm not sure I completely agree with that last bit about the magisterium. If I did, I'd have to become Catholic or Orthodox, I suppose. But it's a handy wake-up call for those who are certain that they can leap straight from the biblical text to the down-home platitudes of wherever they're from, or that they have insights into its meaning that others have been denied.
Right. So in today's episode, we're going to kind of just cut across that and see where the New Testament is actually from.
Right. And one of the first things we're going to look at is this letter from Irenaeus to Florinus, which talks about how the events of the New Testament, the Gospels and the Acts and so on, lived on in oral retellings.
Right. Now, we've talked a lot about Irenaeus in this series, and he was a key church leader and theologian in the late 2nd century.
Yes, he was. And Florinus was someone who had been a church elder, but went extremely wonky, veering off in a Gnostic direction, and so ended up outside of the church. But Irenaeus is still talking to him here. And I think the reason he's invoking these memories is to remind Florinus, look, this is the Orthodox tradition that goes right back to Jesus. For while I was yet a boy, I saw thee in Lower Asia with Polycarp. Polycarp, just a reminder, I know we've mentioned this before somewhere or other. When Polycarp was a young lad in Asia Minor, he was discipled and taught by the elderly Apostle John. And then when he himself was an old man, he discipled Irenaeus and Florinus, a fact of which Irenaeus is now reminding him. For I have a more vivid recollection of what occurred at that time than of recent events, so that I could even describe the place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse, his general mode of life and personal appearance, together with the discourses that he delivered to the people. Also how he would speak of his close friendship with John and with the rest of those who had seen the Lord, and how he'd call their words to remembrance. Whatsoever things he had heard from them respecting the Lord, both with regard to his miracles and his teaching, Polycarp, having thus received from the eyewitnesses of the word of life, would recount them all in harmony with the Scriptures. These things, through God's mercy which was upon me, I then listened to attentively and treasured them up, not on paper, but in my heart. And I'm continually, by God's grace, revolving these things accurately in my mind.
So this quotation really just reminds us that, quite apart from the fact that only a minority of people could read, most churches didn't have more than a few of the books that we call the New Testament. They really relied on oral tradition as well.
And that gave added weight and authority to those who had known Jesus, or later the apostles, or later still, those who had known people who knew the apostles, which is the territory we're into by Irenaeus' day. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Now, what I've done here is taken an excerpt from one of F. Bruce's books, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, in which he talks about the reliability of the New Testament in terms of the manuscripts that we have. So perhaps, he says, we can appreciate how wealthy the New Testament is in manuscript attestation, so evidence of manuscripts, if we compare the textual material for other ancient historical works. For Caesar's Gallic War, for example, composed between 58 and 50 BC, the oldest is some 900 years later than Caesar's day. Of the Roman history of Livy, who lived from 59 BC to AD 17, only one manuscript containing fragments of books 3 to 6 is as old as the 4th century. The text of the extant portions of Tacitus' two great historical works depends entirely on two manuscripts, one of the 9th century and one of the 11th, so hundreds and hundreds of years later. The history of Thucydides, who lived around 460 to 400 BC, is known to us from 8 manuscripts, the earliest belonging to AD 900, and a few papyrus scraps belonging to about the beginning of the Christian era. The same is true of the history of Herodotus, who lived 488 to 428 BC. Yet no classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides is in doubt because the earliest manuscripts of their works, which are of any use to us, are over 1300 years later than the originals.
So manuscripts don't survive because they get destroyed or they just crumble into dust.
Yeah, mostly for that reason. Sometimes they are deliberately destroyed, but that's mercifully rare. It's just that the ability of manuscripts to survive many centuries is very limited, which is why it was the activity of a number of people to copy them, to make sure that there were some newer ones around all the time. And of course, we all know this from the activity of monks during the Middle Ages and so on. Yes. Okay, so still with Bruce, but how different, he says, is the situation of the New Testament in this respect? In addition to 2 excellent manuscripts of the 4th century, which are the earliest of some thousands known to us, considerable fragments remain of papyrus copies of books of the New Testament, dated from 100 to 200 years earlier still. So instead of 300 and something, maybe as early as 100 or at least 200 and something. The Chester Beatty biblical papyri contained most of the New Testament writings. One of these, containing the 4 Gospels with Acts, belongs to the first half of the 3rd century. Another, containing Paul's letters and Hebrews, was copied at the beginning of the 3rd century. Some papyrus fragments dated by papyrological experts not later than AD 150, contain what has been thought by some to be portions of a fifth gospel, containing strong affinities with the canonical four. But much more probable is that these fragments were written by someone who had the four Gospels before him and knew them well, that they did not profess to be an independent Gospel, but were paraphrases designed for explanation and instruction. Earlier still is a fragment containing John 18, verses 31 to 33 and 37. Now in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, dated on paleographical grounds around AD 130, showing that the latest of the four Gospels, which was written according to tradition at Ephesus between AD 90 and 100, was circulating in Egypt within about 40 years of its composition. So to sum up, we may quote the verdict of the late Sir Frederick Kenyon. The interval then between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed.
Wow. Now, if you're a little bit nerdy, then you'd probably get a little excited about that last bit there. You can kind of hear the nerds going "hoorah" in the background. but
Yeah.
but since this is kind of a long quotation, and you probably lost concentration or focus somewhere in the middle, the main point here is that the manuscript evidence for the events described in the New Testament is really on a totally different level to anything else in the ancient world. And so, on evidence grounds, there's no reason to disbelieve them.
Right, that's basically what he's saying. There's no comparison between the manuscript evidence for the events described in the New Testament and the manuscript evidence for anything else at all in the ancient world. It is overwhelming for the New Testament. And that's even before we start to take into account the references to the New Testament writings from church fathers, the references to events in the Gospels from secular Roman writers referring to Jesus and to his followers and so on. So, yeah, you put all of that together and it's absolutely massive.
Right.
Well, I've put a table here which we're not going to go through blow by blow. You might be relieved to hear. But for people who want to know and can look this up, you can simply slow this video down back to this slide and gaze away to your heart's content. So this shows probable dates for when the New Testament books were written. So overwhelmingly, they're written during the 50s, 60s, and 70s of the first century. Galatians is almost certainly the earliest book in the New Testament to be written. You can see it's written around 48. The others sometime after that. There's a big window of time about when Luke was written, sometime between 62 AD and 90. That's quite a large window there. It's much debated. And the situation for Acts is identical because Luke and Acts were originally written as one book and separated only a little later on. They're obviously written by the same author. In the second column there, you can see a number of books, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, and 1 and 2 Peter, where there are 2 alternative little windows in each case. And the or category in brackets in each case is if these books are pseudepigraphal, that is, if 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are not actually written by Paul, then they're probably written sometime between 90 and 110. And if the 1 and 2 Peter aren't written by Peter, between 85 and 90, but assuming that they are legit, then the time frames are as given there. Okay, one of the first big topics we need to look at here concerns something called the Muratorian Fragment. And it takes its name from this guy, Ludovico Antonio Muratori, and you've got his dates there. He was an Italian priest, a prodigious scholar, archivist, and librarian in Modena in central northern Italy. His writings were immensely influential in the 18th century, particularly amongst Catholics. He was a historian as well. He's chiefly known today as the discoverer of the earliest list of New Testament books, which we call the Muratorian Fragment. So here it is. He found the fragment of document in the Ambrosian Library in Milan, and he published it in 1740. It was written in poor Latin, probably in the 8th century, and it had been translated from a Greek original because Greek was very widely used in Italy in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And internal evidence shows that the original was written sometime around 170.
So, how does a 1,000-year-old manuscript just show up in a library? I mean, had no one looked at it in all that time?
It is certainly possible. The Ambrosian Library, although it's named after St. Ambrose, whom we've considered in this series, of course, wasn't actually founded until the early 17th century. So maybe about 100 years before Muratori was working there. And they had scoured Europe for loads of old manuscripts and books to get themselves a decent collection together. And by golly, they had. So it's certainly possible that it had not been properly looked at. It was just there with a pile of a collection, you know. I have to admit that I haven't read all of the books in my personal library.
Now that I
So if you can
disagree.
so if you could just add on another 1,000 years of people being curators of this esteemed collection, there may be something that hasn't been looked at in all that time, and that's what had happened. Or possibly somebody looked at it and didn't realize exactly what they were looking at.
Right.
And that won't exactly be a unique event
Yeah.
in the history of libraries either. Yeah.
This does sound kind of like a dream job, digging through old documents.
Yeah, it does. Yes, there's a lot of us who would like to do nothing better than spend their days generally rootling around in this stuff to see what they could find.
Right.
Well, what does that fragment say? It starts in mid-sentence. Those things at which he was present, he placed thus. Great. The third book of the Gospel, that according to Luke, the well-known physician Luke wrote in his own name in order after the ascension of Christ, and when Paul had associated him with himself as one studious of right. Nor did he himself see the Lord in the flesh, and he, according as he was able to accomplish it, began his narrative with the birth of John the Baptist. The fourth Gospel is that of John, one of the disciples.
So, if Luke is the third book of the gospel and John is the fourth, it's pretty fair to reason that Matthew and Mark were mentioned in the part of the document that we don't have.
It's almost an unavoidable conclusion, yes.
Right.
It must be the case. Moreover, the Acts of all the Apostles are comprised by Luke in one book and addressed to the most excellent Theophilus, because these different events took place when he was present himself, and he shows this clearly, i.e., that the principle on which he wrote was to give only what fell under his own notice by the omission of the passion of Peter. So Peter would later go on to be crucified. That's not mentioned in the book of Acts because it happens after the book of Acts closes. And also of the journey of Paul when he went from the city, Rome, to Spain, again, not mentioned in Acts, but nevertheless a known, or at least almost universally believed, fact. As to the epistles of Paul, again, to those who will understand this matter, they indicate of themselves what they are and from what place or with what object they were directed. The blessed Apostle Paul, following the rule of his predecessor John, writes to no more than 7 churches by name in this order: the first to the Corinthians, the second to the Ephesians, the third to the Philippians, the fourth to the Colossians, the fifth to the Galatians, the sixth to the Thessalonians, the seventh to the Romans. Moreover, he writes twice to the Corinthians and Thessalonians for their correction. He wrote, besides these, one to Philemon and one to Titus, and 2 to Timothy, in simple personal affection and love indeed, but yet these are hallowed in the esteem of the Catholic Church.
Now, that phrase simply means the all-embracing church, because we're way too early for it to mean the Roman Catholic, like in our sense.
Yes, it means not the heretical sects whom he's about to mention. Okay. So, and in the regulation of ecclesiastical discipline, there are also in circulation one to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians, forged under the name of Paul and addressed against the heresy of Marcion. And there are also several others which cannot be received into the Catholic Church, for it's not suitable for gall to be mixed with honey. So it seems that definite apostolic authorship was essential for books to be considered canonical scripture.
Yeah, a lot of these books that he's mentioning sounds a lot like the Bible that we have now.
Right. Well, this is why this fragment is so significant. It includes nearly all of them, but there are a couple of little wrinkles, as we're about to see. So, the Epistle of Jude, indeed, and 2 belonging to the above named John, or bearing the name of John, are reckoned among the Catholic epistles. This is Catholic in a different sense. It means sent to everybody at large, not addressed to one congregation or to one person, like the ones that he's just listed. And the Book of Wisdom, written by the friends of Solomon in his honour, is admitted. We receive also the Apocalypse of John, Revelation, and that of Peter, though some amongst us will not have this latter read in church. The pastor, moreover, did Hermas write very recently in our own times, that the pastor or the shepherd of Hermas wrote very recently in our own times in the city of Rome. Now there's a clue as to when this was written, because the shepherd of Hermas comes from the middle of the 2nd century, so this is going to be, say, a generation later than that. And therefore it also ought to be read, but it cannot be made public in the church to the people, nor placed among the prophets, as their number is complete, nor among the apostles to the end of time. So, to be reckoned as having scriptural authority, something needed to be definitely apostolic, written by the apostles. So, how does this Muratorian fragment differ from our list of 27 books? Well, it doesn't mention the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, but only because we've lost an early piece of the document. Mentioning Luke as the 3rd book of the Gospel strongly implies that Matthew and Mark had already been mentioned.
And apparently, this writer wasn't the only one from the late 2nd century to be familiar with all 4 Gospels.
No, Irenaeus talks about the 4 Gospels being like the 4 corners of the earth, so like a figure of speech, meaning that this fact was very, very, very well established. He could take it for granted that everybody knew it. So the Gospels that we have had established themselves as being uniquely authoritative at a very early date. Yes. Hebrews, James, 1 and 2 Peter are not mentioned. Now, the first of those, Hebrews, in any case, had little circulation in Western churches. We will come back to this topic. And only 2 epistles of John are mentioned, not 3. The author also seems to recognize the apocalypse of Peter and the wisdom of Solomon as legitimate. Now, no churches now recognize the first of those, but Catholic and Orthodox churches do accept the latter in their Apocrypha. Okay, so now we come to this guy, Eusebius of Caesarea.
Now, we've met Eusebius several times in earlier episodes of the series. He wrote the first church history. He also wrote a ridiculously hagiographic biography of Emperor Constantine.
Yes, he did. So, yeah, we've definitely dealt with him before, and we're leaping on here about 150 years for reasons we're about to notice. Okay, so here's Eusebius writing actually in his church history around the year 325. It'll be well, he says at this point, to classify the New Testament writings already referred to. We must, of course, put first the Holy Quartet of the Gospels, followed by the Acts of the Apostles. The next place in the list goes to Paul's epistles, and after them we must recognize the epistle called 1 John, likewise 1 Peter. To these may be added, if it is thought proper, the revelation of John, the arguments about which I shall set out when the time comes.
So, we noticed in last week's episode that he really didn't like the early church's teaching about the end times. So, I guess it's no surprise that he wasn't really a fan of Revelation.
Yeah, that's true. But also, he's from the East. Remember, he's from Caesarea. And just as Hebrews didn't have much circulation in the West, so Revelation didn't have a lot of circulation in the East. And again, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. These are classed as recognized books. Those that are disputed, yet familiar to most, include the epistles known as James, Jude, and 2 Peter, and those called 2 and 3 John, the work either of the evangelist or of someone else with the same name. Among spurious books must be placed the Acts of Paul, which was written in the middle of the 2nd century, the Shepherd, and the Revelation of Peter, also the alleged Epistle of Barnabas and the Didache, together with the Revelation of John, if this seems the right place for it. As I said before, some reject it, others include it among the recognized books.
So, now some of these works are blameless. He's just saying that they're not apostolic.
Right, yes, spurious seems rather a strong adjective for the Shepherd or the Didache, or the Epistle of Barnabas for that matter. They are all fair enough books. It's just that they are not apostolic, right? Moreover, some have found a place in the list for the Gospel of the Hebrews, a book which has a special appeal for those Jews who've accepted Christ. These would all be classed with the disputed books, but I've been obliged to list the latter separately, distinguishing those writings which, according to the tradition of the Church, are true, genuine, and recognized, from those in a different category, not canonical, but disputed, yet familiar to most churchmen. For we mustn't confuse these with the writings published by heretics under the name of the apostles, as containing either Gospels of Peter, Thomas, Matthias, and several others besides these, or Acts of Andrew, John, and other apostles. To none of these has any churchman of any generation ever seen fit to refer in his writings. Again, nothing could be farther from apostolic usage than the type of phraseology employed, while the ideas and implications of their contents are so irreconcilable with true orthodoxy that they stand revealed as the forgeries of heretics. It follows that so far from being classed even among the spurious books, they must be thrown out as impious.
So the spurious books give themselves away by both language and expressions used, and by doctrine that deviates from what the apostles are known to have taught.
Right. And that is a judgment with which modern scholarship concurs. Some modern scholars want to dispute whether apostles really did write some of the books that we have now in our New Testament. But if there's a scholar somewhere who argues that one of the books that has been long since rejected, spurious or apocryphal, really was written by an apostle, I have yet to hear of that argument.
Right.
So, yeah, modern scholarship would back Eusebius up on all of this. Well, while we're on the subject of this man, we ought to also mention the so-called Eusebian canons. And this is the practice of dividing the Gospels into sections. The practice of dividing them into chapters, which we have now, didn't come into use until the 13th century, and into verses not until the 16th century. And I remember being quite flummoxed as a postgrad student, getting to grips with, I think it was an English Bible from the 1530s or something like that, and finding that the chapters fitted what I was used to. But there were suddenly these sections which were about 2 or 3 times as long as our verses. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? Because, of course, it was only during the course of that century that verses as we have them now came into general usage. So the Eusebian canons are those which did this kind of dividing up. It made things handier for people to refer to, and it comes from him. Yeah.
It is kind of hard to imagine reading the Bible without these divisions as just one long manuscript.
Right, yes. Well, that's what people would have done before this time. Just like any other text, just roll straight over, yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, time for one of our little book reviews here. So, the Apocryphal New Testament. Some of the books that we've just mentioned, and a load more we haven't had time to mention, are included within its covers. A lot of books claimed apostolic authorship and therefore authority. That's why these books were written this way or entitled this way, to lend authority to things that were actually written quite a while after. They're clearly spurious, and for the kind of reasons that Eusebius gives, because of anachronistic references or language, or by heretical, usually Gnostic, not always, but usually Gnostic teachings. Yes.
Now, this book here isn't the only collection of New Testament Apocrypha. There are many others on the market.
Yes, you just need to go to, well, let's say some well known bookselling site and enter in Apocrypha New Testament or something, and the world's your oyster. You'll have at least half a dozen of these kinds of collections. Yes.
Right.
Well, moving on a little further, we need now to look at Jerome.
Okay, so now this is the guy you've threatened in previous episodes to drag us all back to.
Yes, and this is where I fulfill my threats. So he lives from sometime around the mid 340s until 420. So he's, what, say a decade older than Augustine? He's a contemporary, but not an exact contemporary, but certainly overlapping with him in lifespan generally. And he's particularly important because he is the principal translator, or at least compiler, of the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible, which would dominate the medieval West. So here's a basic outline of his life. He's born to a prosperous Illyrian Christian family in Stridon, which is a town that was destroyed by Goths actually in 379 when he would have been 30 or early 30s, but which was likely somewhere in modern Slovenia or northwest Croatia. But we can't really identify.
And maybe you should explain who the Illyrians were.
Right, well, the Illyrians were a bunch of people groups whom the Romans invaded in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Illyria is a very vague sort of term geographically, and we might take it as referring to almost anywhere along the eastern Adriatic coast and some way inland therefrom, right? So it might be all the way down to what we now call Albania, but in this case, he's somewhere much, much further north than that. So they were a bunch of tribal peoples who had been significantly Romanized, and certainly he was, and that's his background. And as a youth, he was sent to Rome to study. He seems to have lived a sadly predictable bad life there as a student, but then was convicted in his conscience. He took Cicero as his model for Latin style, something that remained with him. Cicero was a 1st century BC Roman orator. Having been converted, he was baptized at the age of 20 and became highly ascetic. So much so that around 373, when he would have been nearly 30, he went to the Syrian desert as a hermit for 4 or 5 years. And he had a dream in which he was accused of being a Ciceronian more than a Christian, because he was a kind of like stylistic and academic snob, let us say. And so he took this as the prod that he needed to go and learn biblical Hebrew, which he did from a local rabbi. After being a hermit for a few years, he then went to Constantinople and studied theology under one of the most important church fathers of the later 4th century, Gregory of Nazianzus, and he was ordained as a priest. And from there, he goes back to Rome, and this is the bit that always boggles my mind. He became a secretary to, of all people, Pope Damasus.
Yeah, I would have liked to seen these two together. I mean, you've got hyper ascetic Jerome and Pope Damasus, who's known as the ladies' ear tickler. They must have had an interesting working relationship.
I don't know how they even spoke to one another, but yeah, apparently they got on all right. And well, I don't know. Maybe Jerome knew that Damasus wasn't really okay, but Damasus felt that Jerome was, and entrusted him with some significant responsibilities. Yeah. Um, but while he was there, he got into a bit of a scandal himself. His preaching on asceticism was so extreme that one female devotee, Blycilla, who was only 20 years old, died from excesses of the regime that he'd kind of prescribed for her. And so in 384, because there was a bit of an outcry, he retreated, left Rome, and went to Bethlehem, where he spent the rest of his life. And while there, he supervised a monastery. And I can't say this without a titter, but a bunch of high society ladies who thought that Jerome's teaching was absolutely wonderful followed him all the way from Rome to Bethlehem and set up a convent of nuns up the road from his monastery. And Mr. Freud can make that what he will.
Right. We won't dwell on that, perhaps.
No, we won't. We'll just try not to think about it. Right. Okay. So, what about his writings? Well, early on, even while he was in Constantinople, he'd undertaken translations of Eusebius and Origen into Latin. Eusebius and Origen had been writing, of course, in Greek. Um, he carried on theological controversies with opponents both living, like Pelagius and Juvinian, who were at the centre of their big dispute with Augustine, and the dead, for example, Origen.
So he wrote against Pelagius and Jovinian. So he sided with Augustine?
More than with Pelagius, yes. His relationship with Augustine was patchy. He wrote loads of letters of spiritual counsel to his followers, because he had more than just the ladies living up the road, you understand, and a theological debate to other churchmen, like Augustine. He wrote some history. He attempted a sequel to Eusebius' ecclesiastical history to bring things up to his own time. And most importantly, this is why we're really interested in him today, his translation of the Bible into Latin, which took 23 years and which we know today and have done since the late Middle Ages as the Vulgate, meaning the common version in the West. But he also wrote commentaries on almost every book of the Bible during the last 15 years of his life. So he was absolutely prolific. Well, this is what he has to say about the, by his time, fairly old chestnut concerning Hebrews and Revelation. The epistle, which is entitled To the Hebrews, is accepted as the Apostle Paul's not only by the churches of the East, but by all church writers in the Greek language of earlier times, although many judge it to be by Barnabas or Clement, that would be Clement of Rome. It's of no great moment who the author is, since it's the work of a churchman and receives recognition day by day in the church's public reading. It's a dangerous argument, if you ask me, but anyway, if the custom of the Latins doesn't receive it among the canonical scriptures, neither, by the same liberty, do the churches of the Greeks accept John's Apocalypse, Revelation. Yet we accept them both, not following the custom of the present time, but the precedent of early writers, who generally make free use of testimonies from both works. And this they do not, as they are wont on occasion, to quote from apocryphal writings, as indeed they use examples from pagan literature, but treating them as canonical and ecclesiastical works.
So, Jerome's argument is that the early church fathers quote both books as if they were scripture, not in the same way that they might quote like the Apocrypha or pagan literature. And so that shows that both books should count as scripture.
Right, he's saying that the early church fathers recognized it as scripture, and therefore so should we.
Right.
And that's, I think, a reasonable argument. Yes. Yes. Okay, well, this is what he has to say about the status of some of the shorter epistles, about which there was more discussion at the time and still is today quite often. So, Peter, he says, wrote two epistles which are called Catholic.
Now, Catholic here means written to the churches in general, not just to one church or one person.
Right, right. The second of which, on account of its stylistic differences from the first, is considered by many not to be by him. And I put this in square brackets here. Jerome suggests elsewhere that Peter might have used different translators from the Aramaic. Peter, don't forget, is an Aramaic speaking fisherman from Galilee, right? So he may have a point there. James, he says, wrote a single letter which is reckoned among the 7 Catholic epistles. Even so, some claim that it was published by another person under James's name and gradually gained authority as time went on.
Jerome sounds pretty non committal on the subject.
Yes, he doesn't really express an opinion about it. So that suggests that he maybe thinks that the critics were correct on that point. Jude, the brother of James, left a short epistle, which is reckoned among the 7 Catholic epistles, but it's rejected by many because in it he quotes from the apocryphal book of Enoch. Nevertheless, by age and use, it's gained authority and is reckoned among the Holy Scriptures.
It's all messy, murky kind of stuff, isn't it? I mean, should we kick Jude out of the New Testament? And if we don't, does that mean that we should accept the book of Enoch as well?
No one, repeat, no one should think that looking at history honestly or following this channel will vindicate them and their group. Often there simply aren't clear cut answers. So, yeah, this, along with everything else, is murky too. Welcome to reality. Okay, well, we really particularly also want to pay attention to his translation of the Vulgate. Very controversially, not controversial to us, but controversial at the time. He based his translation of the Old Testament on Hebrew. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking, as our viewers are thinking, well, what else would anybody do? All right. But Augustine and most other Christians of the day objected. The Septuagint, by the way, the Roman LXX there is the standard shorthand for Septuagint because by tradition it had been produced by 70 translators in Alexandria. The Septuagint is the Greek translation made in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC. It was considered inspired, even though it was a badly flawed translation of the Hebrew. And here comes another load of trouble. A lot of Christian apologetic arguments had been based upon the Septuagint. And the New Testament quotes the Old Testament from the Septuagint, sometimes where there are crucial differences from the Hebrew, such as in Paul's argument making a fine distinction between seed and seeds. And you go back to the Hebrew and it doesn't stack up, but it does from the Septuagint. Well, glumph. So, yeah, murky stuff.
This insistence on the Septuagint as a translation sort of sounds like those people who argue for using only the King James version.
Yes, exactly. If it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, the King James is good enough for me. Yeah, but but yeah, it's appealing to something that has gained authority or got authority over time, and therefore people feel must be a kind of spiritual authority, even if the history doesn't quite back that up. And that's certainly what's going on there. And there have been parallel arguments in modern times about Cyril and Methodius's um, original translation into Old Church Slavonic and so on. Yes. Okay, well, one other thing we should note about Jerome is his idea of the threefold meanings of Scripture. He taught that Scripture had three layers of meaning: historical, symbolic, and spiritual. And to take the first only, he thought, was Jewish because the letter kills. So he thought that looking for the symbolic and spiritual meanings in Scripture was higher or more important. And now, possibly, he was following Clement of Alexandria, who was active particularly around the year 200, who taught a fivefold method of interpretation: historical sense, a doctrinal sense, a prophetic signification, a philosophical sense, and a mystical sense.
I think Jordan Peterson would add a sixth, the psychological meaning.
Absolutely. And look at the amount of attention that's being given to that right now. Yes. Well, Clement's pupil, Origen, also taught a threefold system: literal, moral, or spiritual, and anagogical, mystical, or possibly apocalyptic. And these are methodologies which absolutely bedeviled the Middle Ages. So, for what it's worth, I think that many scriptures do, in fact, have different layers of meaning. But the problem with these systems is that they want to apply it to all of Scripture. And therefore, even where the literal meaning is the most important one, all this other stuff gets foisted upon it, and you start reading stuff into it that may well not be there. Right? So, simply taking it as a rule, you end up in a situation where the central meanings of Scripture get ignored by somebody playing some kind of philosophical game with all of this stuff, with the idea that a spiritual meaning is somehow higher and it cannot simply mean what it says on a flat reading, even though sometimes that will be the case.
Do you think this goes back to like an early Western obsession for creating systems and lists for everything?
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think this really comes out of Neoplatonic itch to want to find something spiritual back of everything that is purely literal or physical. The systematizing thing doesn't really kick in the West until the 16th century. I think we would have to say that. Calvin is often called the first modern man for this reason.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
yeah, I think that's not really there here. No, and in any case, not all of this is Western. Some of this is coming from the Eastern end of things as well. So yeah.
Right.
Well, we should also mention, particularly importantly, perhaps in respect of the development of the canon, this man Athanasius. Now he really became famous in his own lifetime as the champion of Nicene orthodoxy against Arianism. But we want to pay attention to him here because he's the first to produce a list. As it happens, it was in a pastoral letter he wrote in 367, including all 27 books of what would finally be regarded as the New Testament canon. So he's the first one whose list is identical to ours. And subsequent lists agreed with him, and the Council of Carthage in 397 affirmed the same judgment.
So from composition to agreed upon canon, it takes about 300 years.
Yeah, that's what you get when there's no postal services. I mean, it's no surprise that the earliest churches had knowledge of maybe just one, maybe two or three of these books, right? Because there's no printing, there's no postal service. And so it takes a long, long time before the information loops can be closed. For us in a digital age, it can all be instant, and still we mess things up, right? Okay, so all we've tried to do here is to give an overview of this big but very important subject. So let's finish with the recommendation of a couple of books by F. Bruce, one of which I particularly strongly want to recommend, and that is The Canon of Scripture. Bruce was one of the leading New Testament scholars of the 20th century. His book, The Books and the Parchments, is also really good, but precisely on this subject, his account of the canon and the development of the canon includes pretty much all the material that we've looked at today, I think, but loads more besides. So people who are interested in this, just for their own personal study or because they're having discussions with various people coming from different kind of belief backgrounds, I would recommend that as a very important addition to anyone's library. Yeah.
Right. Or if you want to sound really impressive at your next church gathering.
Something like that. Yeah.
Now, these podcasts may be free, but my guess is that our subscribers' book budgets have gone through the roof since we started.
Well, that is the general idea. I'm actually a secret agent for the publishing industry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, here's a question to finish with. If the institutional church, as we saw, decided which books were in the Bible, doesn't that mean that the institutional church is the supreme authority in matters of belief? It's the church, after all, that determined what counts as Bible, which is the thrust behind that rather naughty meme which we have here and which we looked at the beginning.
Right. Right. Now, this is a hand grenade that you've chucked at us before.
Yes. Do you remember what the response to it is or should be?
Oh, gosh.
Now, here's your
Not
test.
right. Yeah. Apparently, not as well as I should.
Okay, well, F. Bruce points out that the reality is that the councils and the people like Athanasius in the late 4th century, what they were doing was not deciding, that's a caricature. They were recognizing what had always been recognized by the churches, plural, since the beginning. That the various churches had always recognized these books. Well, I say always, some had been disputed and discussed, of course, debated. But the weight of opinion of how these books had been used within the churches clearly meant that these are the ones that win out in those discussions because they had lengthy enough pedigrees behind them. So that doesn't mean that the discussion on every single book is once and forever closed. Far from it. The discussions still go on and they're quite lively. But nevertheless, there is very strong consensus about the vast majority of these books, pretty much along the lines that we've sought to describe here, and which, as I've said, Bruce does in a lot more detail. So it's not a case of the institutional church deciding, but of them recognizing what had long been recognized by churches in the plural. So, yeah.
So we can still rest easy on our pillows tonight.
Well, we'll try and mess it up again at some future stage, I guess. Yeah.
Right. And speaking of books, do you want to tell our viewers what we're going to be looking at next?
Well, there may be relief all around, or disappointment, who knows, that this is finally the end of this series, and we're going to be doing something completely different for a few weeks starting next week. And it's a short-ish series, 4 episodes, on modern novels, 4 modern novels that get far too little attention in the Anglosphere, even though they are absolute classics in the countries from which they come. And next week, we're going to be starting with
The Bridge on the Drina, which, if anybody watching this is a former EMWer, you will be very familiar with that book.
Yeah, and it was their favourite reading because they much preferred doing that than to doing all the history and theology with me.
Well,
So,
yes, I can't.
well,
That is.
yeah. So, yes, Ivo Andrić and The Bridge on the Drina, it was his Nobel Prize winning novel about life in a little Bosnian town over several centuries. So, we're going to be diving into that. It has so much to tell us, not simply about Bosnia, but about the rather agonizing process of becoming modern. So, that's what we're going to be doing next week. So, please do join us for that, people. And in the meantime, please do repost links to this episode and other episodes that you like on social media. But thank you for staying with us.
And we'll see you next week, everyone.
Bye bye now.